Yeah, and even without quotas, there's still ways to hold someone accountable towards doing their job. I
Exactly.
mean, there's plenty of ways. It's just with that, I think people feel, again, going back to this culture, thinking, well, this is the easiest thing to measure, which means that I kind of have more control and understanding over it. Whereas without them, there is a bit more of a free rein to be able to develop people and build a more effective culture and better, not just salespeople, but people.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That is Chris Hatfield. Chris is founder of Sales Psyche, which works to develop and support the mental health and performance of sales teams, as well as the mental health and performance of sales managers. And in this conversation from the archives of the Sales Enablement Podcast, Chris and I are talking all about all aspects of mental health and sales, including how to tackle the stigma of mental health in the workplace. Chris and I have a wide-ranging conversation about the impact of mental health on performance at all levels in sales and why it continues to represent one of the biggest threats to the overall well-being and performance of a sales team, especially in today's uncertain economic environment. We dig into the unacknowledged cost of mental health on an organization and on the individual, both in terms of lost work days and diminished performance. And then we go deep into how to create a healthy sales culture and the changes in perspective that are required at all levels within the organization to build and sustain that culture. And then we talk about Chris's 4 keys to mental resilience and why the key to sales brilliance is indeed mental resilience. So we get into all of this and much, much more. But before we get to Chris, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for that. Let's jump into it. Chris Hatfield. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Well, my pleasure. So where have you been sheltering during the pandemic?
Sheltering in good old London.
London.
Lockdown, yeah.
And sort of, they're like going through a second lockdown now, right?
We are. We're coming to an end of it. We've got a week and a bit, but we'll see what happens after that. See how well behaved people are.
Yeah, well, yeah, good luck on that. At least based on behaviors here in Southern California.
Yeah.
I mean, the big thing is, you're a soccer fan, as am I, and big Premier League fan, and it'd just be nice to see fans back in the stadium. It's really weird watching all the matches, and my audience is accustomed to me talking about this because I talk about soccer all the time, but it's just weird watching the matches and no energy missing from the 60,000 people or however many.
Yeah, it's just, it feels very soulless, and even though there's fake crowd noise, which I don't like having on, because I actually prefer to hear what the managers are saying.
Yeah, I want to hear them yelling at the team.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, that day, it's going to come. We've got all this good news about vaccine. Hopefully it proves to be what it says it is, and we can get that distributed in maybe, 6 months, a year. Well, I think at least there's light at the end of the tunnel. So even if it's 6 months or a year, at least know we're heading in the right direction. So, well, to that point, this is a favorite question I'm asking all my guests these days is, what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself during the pandemic?
Oh, that's a good question. So actually, I quit my full-time job during the pandemic. And
good. Wow.
Yeah. It's the opposite reaction to what people normally give me.
Usually it's like, you're crazy. What are you thinking?
Yeah. But it's reaffirmed, I think, I learned this over my career so far in life, but just reaffirmed it that there is always something better when you make that jump. If your gut instinct is telling you to, trust it and back yourself, because when you do, then things will start happening because of that focus that you've got. So I think the biggest thing I've learned throughout pandemic is trusting myself, trusting the process, and looking back on things that didn't necessarily make sense, but do now.
Mm-hmm. So you quit your other job in order to devote full time to Sales Psych?
Yeah. So Sales Psyche has kind of been people will say, how long have you been thinking about it? I suppose it's been the process of my whole career, but I didn't actually think of the business until I was on furlough this year, actually. Mm-hmm. But the passion behind it and the kind of focus has been building bit by bit over time, which points to what I just mentioned around not necessarily making sense, but when you look back, all the pieces were then put together.
Yeah, interesting. Because I mean, it seems very well thought out, and we're gonna dive into that. So we've had multiple conversations on this show about mental health and sales. So we've got having more coming out. It's a regular topic we're trying to address.
Mm-hmm.
But sales psyche, if we pronounce the E on the end, you're really taking sort of a different approach to that, because you're, instead of saying, gosh, here are resources to help you, you're talking about what are the strategies we can implement for prevention and intervention with sellers before it becomes a crisis.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, going back to the kind of pandemic, what it's done, it's lifted this veil off of around the topic of mental health. And I think made people sit up and pay attention to it more, of how important it is. And I think, it's not enough now just to talk about it, just to say, look, we're here if you need to talk. And that is important still, of course. But I felt one of the reasons why I started it was that's all people were doing, is talking about it. And it's good that people are able to now be more open with it. And it's more of a conversation on things like LinkedIn. But it's more about, as you mentioned, going to the preventative piece and going, what can we do to help people, reps and managers, before they even get to that point?
Well, and even a bit larger, I think you're aspiring to say is, look, how do we actually change sales cultures and corporate cultures in such a way as to integrate prevention and intervention into that? And I want to dive into that, but just, sort of leading off, is seems like one of the real impetus sort of to start this was that you mentioned you suffer from some pretty debilitating anxiety earlier in your sales career. So what were you selling and what happened?
Yeah, so it started developing when I was at university, and I started noticing it, and then came out. I did sports coaching at university, so that's where the kind of coaching blood from me comes in. Is always
so what were you coaching?
Football. Or soccer to your main audience.
Well, football to me, soccer to most of them.
Yeah. And that's where it kind of started. And then for some reason, I think, again, it's just probably part of me pushing into my uncomfortable zone, started doing door-to-door sales. So 100% commission only, loft and cavity wall insulation, and solar panels.
Solar panels and insulation. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, which isn't bad in England, to be honest, because it's very cold.
That's right. You need it cold and damp. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the solar panels, you don't really think of London as being, I know you don't need to have direct sunshine, cloudless skies in order to capture solar, but it seems like it helps, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It was the rent-a-roof scheme, which is basically renting your roof out for 30 years.
Oh, okay. Got it. All right.
Yeah.
But minimize your power bills basically to nothing.
Yes. Yeah. And I'd ask people, what color are your tiles? And they say, I don't know. And I say, well, you don't look at your roof much, do you?
Yeah. Well, I probably couldn't have answered that. Well, that's not out here is all sort of, stucco colored stuff. But yeah. All right. So what happened? Was there some like moment where it's like, an anxiety attack or something? It's just like, okay, I need to deal with this.
It was probably a culmination of moments, and just sort of realizing when it happens. And for people who find it hard to empathize with anxiety, I always use the analogy. It's a bit like you're expecting a test to be sprung on you. You don't know when, you don't know where, you don't know what any of the answers are, but your life depends on it. That's the kind of like feeling I tell people, and straight away they're like, I get it. But it was a number of moments that kind of made me feel like that. And when I was feeling that way, I couldn't operate properly. I want to lock myself away. I didn't want to talk to anyone. And I just sort of felt like, I don't want this to be my life. I don't want this to be a label that just sabotages me. I don't want to go onto medication and just be, guided by limitations of what I can't do because of this feeling.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about how you've learned how your anxiety could serve you rather than, as you just said, sabotage you. So tell us about that. I mean, what was that learning curve, and how does your anxiety serve you today? Yeah,
I think, it's been a process along the way. But what I've found now is actually when I start to feel anxious about things, it's actually benefiting me, because it's telling me something isn't quite right. And if it is, then I go back and check it and I'm reassured. And if it isn't, I'm then able to stay on top of things. It's really helped me be proactive with my business, with my previous roles, at thinking ahead about like the possibilities of what could go wrong and being proactive in developing it. So I actually look back and go, do you know what? I'm really grateful that I'm anxious, and because and I think a big thing around this is your mindset and your perception towards it. All emotions are there to serve us, and I think it's just our perception sometimes that sort of filters that in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yes, and yeah, perspective is very key, and yeah, we're gonna dig into that too. I mean, as we go through, because I think it's you talk about sort of needing a change of perspective about a number of things, and I think that will help the mental well-being of sellers, and I agree. So before we get into that, though, so tell us about what you're trying to do with sales psyche.
Yeah, I'll start with our mission. The mission is to create healthier minds, sales pipelines, and vibrant cultures. It's focusing on, with sales reps and managers, providing them with the tools and the understanding to develop and reinforce their mindset, not just their skill set.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the preventative piece. It's bringing that education and that understanding around it. And I've started talking more recently about these kind of 3 A's around it, in the attention,
Right.
awareness, and action. So bringing attention to some of these topics that are either just ignored or taken for granted by people that maybe don't struggle with them as much. Then the awareness piece is being able to label this, because that's the biggest thing, with any coaching as well. If we're not just talking about mental health and well-being here, the sooner you can label something, the sooner you can understand it. And building someone's self-awareness around going, do you know what? I've got imposter syndrome, or I've been struggling with burnout, straight away helps them understand it a lot more. And then being able to provide them with the action to then go forth and either book in a session to have a confidential and impartial conversation with a coach, or by providing them with courses, anonymous Q&As, and morning mindset sessions to help them build that understanding and that knowledge around it.
And I think it's important for people to understand, as you pointed out, that what we tend to overlook completely, almost, I would say, in sales, just as a sort of a cultural artifact, is the direct tie between performance and mental well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And as you also pointed out, I mean, we're not just talking about depression and anxiety. We're talking about addiction, substance abuse. We're talking about, you mentioned imposter syndrome, right? I mean, there's all sorts of fears that manifests itself that for sellers, that the answer has always been before is, well, what training does this person need?
Yeah.
As opposed to, let's try to really understand what's going on. And perhaps it is one of these things that's things in personal life. I've gone through a divorce, and let me tell you, my performance during that period was not good. Even though I thought it was okay, but yeah, it wasn't, right? I mean, you can't fool yourself, or maybe you can fool yourself, but you can't fool others, let's say.
Yeah.
So, but in my case, I was lucky. I had, an empathetic boss that understood what was going on, but most people aren't so lucky.
No, they're not. And, I think people just need to remind themselves that very, very, very rarely will someone be underperforming intentionally. There is always a reason behind it. And the best thing you can do is to go in and look to understand the problem or the challenge that they're going through, and have a conversation with them before coming in with, you need training, you need a PIP, you need this X, Y, and Z, and making assumptions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that for people who are undergoing some sort of mental stress, that PIP is always a great hammer to use.
Yeah.
There was just some conversation about that online on LinkedIn not that long ago. It's like, yeah, what are we doing? When that's the case, oftentimes if you're not really interested in getting to the bottom as a manager of what's happening to this individual, that especially if it's a stress-related issue that's holding them back, I mean, the PIP just blows them up, right? It's guaranteed that person, you're escorting that person to a new career opportunity. So yeah, I mean, and you document on your website, I think, some of the things we've talked about in this show, sort of a big threat to your sales success being mental well-being, but it's sort of again, we tend to think about it in terms of the sort of the big moments, but we don't think about it in terms of sort of the unacknowledged impact of sort of day-to-day performance loss through not operating, at sort of peak mental capacity. I mean, really, people working at diminished levels, I think, is the biggest thing you see. I mean, you talk about 2 out of 3 sellers experiencing some form of burnout.
Mm-hmm.
It's not those people aren't showing up; it's just they're not able to perform.
Yeah, exactly. And it is something that, if you look at the numbers, and I know you've probably seen it on the site, it costs the UK economy about 45 billion and the US economy about 100 billion, but 2/3 of that comes from presenteeism. So what you just mentioned there, it's not that
Right.
people aren't turning up, it's when people are present, they're just not present.
Right.
within the moment, like conscious, because so much other stuff is going on in their head. So it's not just about people being off sick, it's, well, how well are people coping when they are trying to work?
And the general explanation for presenteeism is, I'll say the big category you see is lack of engagement. And it's like, well, okay, there's sort of this implicit meaning there that somehow work is boring, or managers aren't engaging with people to challenge them. But I think that's really too simplistic, right? I think that for presenteeism, I would say the majority of it is people that are struggling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, and sales is a tough old game because, of course, when you're struggling and you're not performing, you feel like I need to go even harder. I need to work more. And when you are performing, you think I still need to do the same thing because I still need to stay ahead of the game, and I don't want to lose that title and that recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And it causes people to find it very difficult to slow down. And I think going back to what I said earlier about this veil being lifted, I think it's always been there, these challenges, but because people have been so busy with everything, with socializing and so on, they haven't taken time. Whereas now, being in isolation, people are sitting there with it, listening to their own thoughts and becoming more self-aware with them, that are actually realizing, do you know what? This is something that I might have been masking beforehand by just being busy with everything else.
Well, but isn't the big danger that as we begin to see light at the end of the tunnel and some return over the next, say, 6 months to a year to some sort of whatever this new normal state or next normal state will be, that suddenly everything gets brushed under the rug again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is a risk. And but I do feel like, as I mentioned, I think people are paying more attention to it, and I think when we do go back to that environment, it will just be interesting to see who then thinks, right, okay, well, we'll go back to how we did things, because I think they'll probably find a very big shock if they try and do that with the people they've actually, over that time, if they had started to do things differently, then struggle to maybe retain those people.
Yeah. Well, in your mind, what is a healthy sales culture, a vibrant sales culture?
I think there's a few things. I think, a big thing around it is this kind of coaching first mentality of always looking for a way to be able to empower someone and develop someone in anything that they do within their role, to whether that's to help them become a leader eventually, or just to help them become a better, not just salesperson, but a person.
Mm-hmm.
I think, having that culture where leaders are there to develop them regardless of if they're going to move on or wherever they go to, but just focused on developing them as a person is a big thing. And then I think a big part of it as well is having that open conversation around, and that understanding, that addressing the elephant in the room, that it is tough, that you are going to face these kind of challenges, that it's okay to talk about them. Don't just talk about all these great things you can achieve when someone starts. Address all the challenges that are going to come up, because if you don't and someone encounters them, they're then going to think they're the odd one out, and they can't talk to anyone about it because no one's told them about it.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to your answers you lead off with coaching, and it's almost like we need a different word, right? I mean, I because so much of coaching these days in sales really is deal coaching, opportunity coaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what you're talking about is the one that I think is the most important requirement. Of course, you're always going to do deal coaching, and is this personal development, almost more of a mentorship in some regards. Though I know people don't necessarily like that word, but it's not really it's not tactical coaching either. It's how are you helping this individual develop in a way in order to achieve their goals? And everybody sort of acknowledges it, but they always sort of default to doing the tactical coaching. And I just wondering what you're seeing in terms of companies being receptive to actually enabling their managers to learn how to become this type of coach.
Yeah, I think why it always reverts back to that is that's the quickest route to seeing an outcome sometimes, is thinking we coach on focus on deals and focus on numbers. That's the biggest way we can measure it. And therefore, that's how we need to do things. Whereas I think, what this might seem like, it's not necessarily as a quicker fix, but in the long run, what you're doing is you're building the foundations that you can then start to build the other stuff on top of. It's similar to, why people might want to give advice rather than coaching in the first place, because they think it's a quicker route. But what you're doing is actually just getting people to come back to you over and over, and you're not empowering anyone else in the business, which is not a good way to scale. So I think that's a big part there, is realizing, what, it might take a bit of a longer period, but it's going to be far more sustainable and create a far more consistent approach to it as well.
Yeah, which I agree with 100%. The goal of coaching, in my mind, if I'm coaching a salesperson, and again, distinguish this from doing a pipeline review, an opportunity review, is how can I help them become more self-sufficient? How can I help them recognize and solve problems that they encounter? How can I help them through this process learn how to improve? I mean, yeah. If you're doing anything else, as you said, as a manager, and I think a lot of managers sort of feed off this, is they want people to be dependent on them, right? This is part of what they think their job is I want them to come and ask me a question about every little thing. I want them to, come to me for my advice, as opposed to, there's a great book written recently by Michael Bungay Stanier called The Advice Trap, a follow-up to his book, The Coaching Habit, which talks about this, where it's just so easy to fall into this habit of, as a manager, of giving advice as opposed to helping people learn how to identify the problems they're trying to solve, how to define them, and give them the tools to solve it.
Yeah, and it comes back to what I mentioned before around this imposter syndrome piece, where that in itself might be an underlying reason why managers like that need to feel like they need to justify themselves, because they're almost like, there's 4 different types of imposters that people can suffer with, and a number of them make them feel like, I need to have an answer for everything. I need to be able to do this, because otherwise, what am I doing? Where's the value I'm adding in my role? Which makes people feel insecure, which is why they're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think sort of with that, for managers and for leaders, and you've referred to this as well, and I think this is really a part of it, is if we're going to address sort of the mental well-being issues, is we need to have some changes in perspective within sales itself. And you talk about it's if you're not addressing how someone actually perceives the situation, then you're never going to achieve long-lasting change. So I was wondering what sort of perspectives you're referring to that you think need to change in order to start empowering this change.
Yeah, I think there's a few around this. I think the perspective, one of them we've addressed already on around what you should be coaching on and what you should be focusing on. I think the other perspective is this fixed and growth mindset around this particular topic as well, about being able to develop behaviors and attitudes. And people look at skills and think, yeah, we can train that, but that's why I think people don't focus so much on attitudes, habits, and behaviors, because it's a bit more like, it's we're just going to hire the people for that, and that whatever we get with them, like, that's how they're going to be. We're
going to test them, and this magical assessment is going to tell us who has the right DNA for sales.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which I think is BS, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think they're the perspective, and also I just feel like the perspective on how valuable it is to educate people around their mental health and well-being. I mean, Deloitte published a report earlier this year saying that companies who are investing in employees' well-being are now seeing a 5-to-1 ROI return. So for every dollar they spend, they're getting $5 back, which is showing that, even if you don't have that moral obligation to do this, there is a financial benefit of doing it as well. And it's saying, do you know what, actually, if we work on these foundations, regardless of someone coming in, how much experience they've got, if we invest in this and help them make them a better person rather than just their role, then they will see that value we're providing to them as well. And we'll also just help them become a more well-rounded, healthier human being.
Yeah, well, it's always interesting. You bring up that Deloitte figure. It sort of reminds me of, I don't think it was Deloitte, but another similar firm had done a study about diversity in corporate hiring. And it's funny, as these aspects like diversity or acknowledging the importance of mental health in overall performance of not just sales, but an organization, is these things that people fear the most. That if they actually, people, because quite honestly, so many managers fear diversity. That's why we're not seeing more diverse workforces and so on, is if they address these topics they fear, they actually do better.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest things, and I've had a couple of people say this to me, is, but if we start talking more about mental health and well-being in our company, isn't it giving people excuses to get out of things? And, people have said that. And
sure, that's not surprising at all.
No, but I feel like, well, okay, there's a few things to that. One is, if you feel like you've got people in your business who are going to do that, that's probably down to you to maybe think about your hiring strategy and are you bringing the right kind of people in. But also, people, if you're not talking about it, people are still suffering with this, but they might just be saying, I've got a stomach ache, I've got the flu, I'm not well. So when we start talking about physical health, are we worried of, we can't mention that in case someone says they've got a cold and they don't want to come in today, or they've got a stomach ache? It's the same thing. People are just labeling it different and suffering in silence, which is causing a bigger problem.
Right. Well, I think there are other perspectives that need to change, though, too, that I think contribute to sort of the sort of toxic cultures that exist so often in sales. And, one topic that, people have been talking increasingly about is, is there still a role for quota in sales? Is there some other way to measure people that, I don't say takes the stress out of it, because there's always a performance aspect. There's always stress associated with performance to some degree, but quotas just become this hammer, and we see the results. We see the studies is that fewer than 50% of sellers are even achieving their quotas. So if that's the case, and we've got 2/3 of our sellers experiencing some level of burnout, and so on, isn't that one perspective just needs to change? Is how are we measuring performance, and how are we holding people accountable?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about quota, it's just this number that is plucked out and picked, but then can dictate someone's career, their life, their mood, everything around that. As you mentioned, I think when we talk about stress, there are stress is there to help us servers in the short term, and people react differently to stress. But I think that's the problem, is that it causes that kind of chronic stress over time, which then leads to burnout around that. But I completely agree. I do feel like, I'm not going to sit here and give people the answers to this, but I do feel like there is a way to start looking at this differently in terms of how we are measuring reps to be able to provide that environment for them to feel supported around that, versus at the moment when we're not providing the environment and we're still giving them this number to hit without the full toolkit available to support them on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, one idea I have, and I've managed teams using this in the past, is a productivity measure, which is based on dollars, in our case, dollars of revenue generated per hour of selling time. So here's something that's purely on sort of effectiveness, a little bit on efficiency. It's under the direct control of the individual. If your productivity is at a certain level, as I was managing this team, we knew what people's productivity was, and if they were investing sufficient hours, they were going to achieve a certain amount of revenue. But the attitude toward that was completely different than, I've got a number to hit.
Yeah.
Instead, it was, well, how can I invest in myself in order to improve my effectiveness in front of the customer, in order to say, look, I can generate more dollars per hour that I devote to this particular task.
Yeah, I like that.
I mean, another one I think, just from a perspective standpoint, is this is a big one for me, is that when you look at the way we set up our sales processes, almost universally in sales, is they're all about persuading the customer to buy what we're selling, as opposed to aligning ourselves to the buyer journey and saying, we're here to serve you, to help you make a decision. And I think if people are sent out with that mission to say, look, we are sincerely here to help, as our first pass, right? We're going to help you identify the problem you're trying to solve. We're going to help you identify the options for how you solve this problem. And you take it from that perspective, where the focus more becomes, instead of, let's say, doing a discovery call that helps you know a certain amount of data, but doesn't help you really understand, right? So we have all these steps in our process that are about getting through the step, as opposed to really understanding what the customer is trying to do, that I think are stress creators. And we don't teach people how to appropriately go through that whole process in a way that actually increases the odds of winning. I mean, when everything is, you look at back in the old days, IBM Classic 5 call close, which most sales processes today are an ancestor of. It's like, okay, we prospect, we discover, we qualify, we present, we propose, we close. It's like, well, what's that have to do with what the buyer's trying to do? And so I just think this disconnect with our buyers is part of the problem.
Yeah, definitely. And again, comes back to quota. If you've got a quarterly target or a monthly target, and yet that's not dictated by your buyer, that's dictated by you, which then leads to you trying to speed things up and just working towards a time frame rather than an actual objective. And I think the big thing of this comes down to how people are onboarded and developed initially as well. And where I've seen this work really well, when you first come in, if all you're doing is teaching your reps about your process, about your product, about what you do, then as soon as they get on the phone, that's this level of confidence. If you're not necessarily confident in yourself initially, you'll be confident in what you've been told or taught or trained on. So that's what you're going to talk about. So that's why it's so dictated on, this is our process, this is what we do. Whereas if you flip it and then the first couple of weeks you come in, you don't learn anything about your product, you learn everything about the customer's journey. You speak to the customer, you understand what's important to them, you learn about their world before yours. When you get on that phone, you're far more likely to think, actually, I'm more confident in talking about their world. So tell me about this, and ask questions around that then lead to a more of a natural and customer first approach to it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think this is a change of perspective that needs to happen. Like I said, everything is dictated by this idea of persuasion is our goal. And it's sort of the height of irony that behavior is one behavior that research has shown that universally everybody has a resistance to being persuaded. Every human. So makes sense that then we would train all of our sellers to lead with the one behavior that all of their customers universally hate. And if we think that doesn't contribute to the stress, we're kidding ourselves. And it doesn't have to be that way. No,
and I think that's why sales has a bad name, is because people only really remember their bad experiences. No one necessarily remembers unless you're in sales, no one necessarily looks back and goes, do you know what, that guy sold to me so well? Because when it's good selling, it doesn't feel like selling. And also when it's a good process, we give ourselves more of the credit rather than who has sold to us, thinking, do you know what, I made a really good decision on this holiday or this car, I got a really good deal. You're not saying, do you know what, they sold to me really well, they negotiated. And it's because you don't see it as selling. To your point, is that as soon as it feels like selling, that's when people sort of have that defense mechanism.
But I just think it's back to this idea about perspective, is if we train our sellers to lead with a different perspective, then I think the whole mental makeup of sellers begins to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely agree.
If they understand that selling is actually really a leadership job, right? I mean, you're trying to think about leaders. One of the things leaders do is they clearly communicate a vision and inspire people to follow it. Well, isn't that what you're trying to do with your prospects? You're trying to clearly communicate a vision of what success looks like if they engage with you and provide them inspiration to follow you. And that's a whole different perspective than, go out and persuade this person to buy from us.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
And so I think, but for me, these changes in perspective are so critical. I mean, you talk about, you have this nice model I like about, that I think you call it the key to sales brilliance is based on mental resilience. And you identify 4 areas of that. And one is knowledge, which I agree. Though I think, again, we've sort of added stress into that unnecessarily in sales because, again, we, take something like discovery. We treat it as a discrete step in a selling process when actually it's something you should do every time you interact with the prospect.
Yeah.
Right? Because your job is not knowing, which is what that one discrete step is. I'm going to ask them 10 questions that I ask all my customers, and I sort of at that point know what they want. You need to take the knowledge to the next level, which is understanding. And sellers, and I see this all the time with sellers I talk to that interact with me, is they don't feel like they have the time to get to that level of understanding because they feel so pressed with everything they need to do, their activity metrics and so on.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, as you mentioned, it's kind of like where we're asking sellers to work towards our sort of timeframes rather than the prospects, and then we're also not giving them enough time, as you mentioned there, to really understand about their world and have more of a natural conversation around it because of this arbitrary figure or number that we've put in place.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, companies still need to grow. But I mean, I've worked in environments, high tech or high growth tech companies that have been big successes that we, in one in particular, we didn't have a sales culture, classic sales culture, right? I mean, we didn't have quotas, but the company grew well, very successful. In fact, this company today, as a multi-billion-dollar company, still doesn't have a sales function.
Yeah.
So it's not like, they don't have a CRO, don't have CSO, don't have a VP of sales. They're doing multiple billions of dollars a year in business to business sales and some B2C sales. It's like, okay. I mean, it's like, it's possible. You don't have to. And the CEO, part of the reason we didn't have quotas, he said, it's because he didn't like the idea of running a business where people felt like there's a sword hanging over the back of their neck every month.
Yeah.
He didn't want to create that environment. So it's not like there's only one way to do this. People listening to this, well, if you don't have quotas, how do you hold people accountable? It's like, well, a number of companies are doing it quite successfully.
Yeah, and even without quotas, there's still ways to hold someone accountable towards doing their job. I mean,
exactly.
just there's plenty of ways. It's just with that, I think people feel, again, going back to this culture, thinking, well, this is the easiest thing to measure, which means that I kind of have more control and understanding over it. Whereas without them, there is a bit more of a free rein to be able to develop people and build a more effective culture and better, not just salespeople, but people.
Well, at the end of the day, that really becomes what it's about.
Yeah.
I mean, as a manager, and you referred to this earlier, is your desire should be is not just how do I wring the last ounce of revenue out of this person, but how do I help them develop to the point where, geez, maybe they're ready for the next step, and if we're not the place for them to be able to take the next step, then yay. More power to them if they go somewhere else and find it. And that's fine because you did your job at that point. You helped that person be better when they left than when they showed up.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're creating that kind of culture, they're probably then doing that with people in the team as well, or they're running a team. So even if they do leave, you don't have this massive gap. Sometimes you're thinking, oh, this one person left, how are we going to fill it? is you're creating a culture where there's constantly people being developed all around.
Yeah. Well, that's the goal. So we're going to keep working on that because, I think that in my perspective is that we're just too often in sales, we're just aimed at the wrong target. And these are attitudes and processes and systems we've used for close to 100 years now. Yeah, I find it so interesting that people always talk about this idea, this trope, I call it, about modern selling. But when you look at the average company's sales process and the sort of linear stage-based set of events, it's really no different than it was, I said, 100 years ago. They might have a few more steps in it just because of technology and so on, but it's virtually the same.
Yeah.
And we just haven't really, even despite the trappings of all the technology that has flown into sales and marketing, the way we execute selling has basically stayed the same. We just automated some of it. But I think for really to get this significant change in perspectives is, we need to start changing some of these fundamental things about how we onboard people and train them about what their responsibilities are. And, as I said, serving versus selling, understanding versus just knowing. I mean, things that are really just basic human behaviors.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest, big word thrown around in the last couple of years or more than that now is authenticity. And I think the kind of system in place at the moment stops people from being authentic because it puts it into such a sort of robotic, unauthentic process.
Right. I mean, I speak out often about this oxymoron that we hear so often in sales these days is, mass personalization at scale. And it's like, okay, well, God, we have three oxymorons in that one phrase right there. And yet, I took that directly from a website of a company selling a sales engagement platform. And it's like, that's not a human behavior. That's not authentic at all. Yeah. And I think, and maybe this is an interesting issue we could explore at a later time, but is we know humans have this need for psychological consistency. Is maybe that's one of the things people are struggling with, is there's just this lack of consistency between how we label things and what they truly are, right? I mean, mass personalization at scale, the other word for that is completely impersonal.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. I'm so glad we got this chance. If people want to learn more about sales psyche, where can they do that? Yeah,
sure. So they can find us I wish someone had when they invented the internet, if they could just change the three W's every time we have to say that. But www.salespsyche.co.uk. I also run a couple of podcasts, Not Another Sales Podcast and Master Brilliance with Resilience. So you'll find them on Apple and Spotify as well if you want to check those out. And maybe you can come on there at some point, Andy.
I'd love to. All you have to do is invite me. I'll be there.
Perfect.
All right. I look forward to it. Well, Chris, thank you so much. And I'm sorry about Newcastle.
That's fine. And then just to mention, if anyone, talking of mental health and well-being, if anyone does want a bit more information or, just confidential, where's the best place to start? Because that's the hardest thing sometimes. Just drop me a message on LinkedIn. Always happy to guide you in the right direction.
All right. Chris, thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, I'm so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank Chris Hatfield for sharing his insights and experience with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, to Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for that. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.